In the early days of September 2013, traffic on the George Washington Bridge, one of the busiest bridges in the world, slowed to a near standstill. The bridge connects Fort Lee, New Jersey, to Manhattan, and it carries hundreds of thousands of commuters every day. But for several days that September, chaos erupted on the Fort Lee side. School buses were delayed, emergency vehicles were trapped, and residents sat in their cars for hours without understanding why. To the public, it looked like a simple case of poor planning or an accident. In reality, it was the beginning of one of the most unusual and politically damaging scandals in recent American history, a scandal that would become known as Bridgegate. At the center of the story was Chris Christie, the Republican governor of New Jersey. By 2013, Christie had built a reputation as a tough, outspoken leader with national ambitions. He had been praised for his handling of Hurricane Sandy the year before, and there was open talk about him being a strong contender for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination. Christie was known for his blunt style and his ability to connect with both Republicans and Democrats. But beneath that image of bipartisanship was a political team that valued loyalty above all else, and punished those who didn't fall in line. The trouble began when the mayor of Fort Lee, Mark Sokolik, a Democrat, declined to endorse Christie for re-election. Christie's campaign had been courting local Democratic officials, hoping to show that he had broad, bipartisan support across New Jersey. When Sokolik refused to offer his endorsement, it reportedly angered some within the governor's inner circle. Weeks later, strange events began to unfold on the George Washington Bridge. Without warning, several of the lanes leading from Fort Lee onto the bridge were closed, reducing traffic flow to a crawl. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which manages the bridge, claimed that the closures were part of a traffic study. But there were no records of any approved study, no warning to local officials, and no explanation for the timing. For 4 days, the chaos continued. Parents couldn't get their children to school on time. Police and ambulances were delayed. The mayor's office received angry calls from residents, but Sokolik himself was kept in the dark. He reached out to Christie's administration for help, asking why this was happening, but his messages went unanswered. On the 5th day, the lanes were reopened, and the Port Authority quietly dropped the story. For a while, it seemed like the whole incident might be forgotten. But journalists and local legislators began to suspect that something wasn't right. In the months that followed, reporters and lawmakers started digging into the Port Authority's communications. The agency had long been a source of political power, with appointees from both New York and New Jersey using it to reward allies and maintain influence. The Bridgegate scandal entered a new phase as investigations turned into courtroom battles. The summer of 2015 brought indictments that officially transformed a political controversy into a criminal case. Bridget and Kelly, Bill Baroni, and David Wildstein were charged with conspiracy and fraud for orchestrating the lane closures on the George Washington Bridge. Federal prosecutors argued that the trio had abused their authority, turning one of the nation's busiest transportation routes into a tool for political payback. The charges painted a picture of a small group of political loyalists who valued revenge more than public service. Each defendant faced the possibility of years in prison, but the larger question hovering over the case was whether the governor himself had known what they were doing. By that time, Chris Christie's once rising political career was already faltering. When the scandal first broke, he had hoped to contain the damage with his public apology and dismissals. But the indictments revived old suspicions. As the 2016 presidential race began to take shape, Christie announced his campaign for the Republican nomination. He hoped to run on his record as a bold, no-nonsense governor who could get results. Yet everywhere he went, reporters brought up Bridgegate. His rivals quietly used it to question his integrity, and voters who once saw him as a straight talker began to wonder if he was hiding something. The scandal became an invisible shadow that followed him from one campaign stop to the next. David Wildstein was the first to crack. He agreed to plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony was a major breakthrough for the government's case. Wildstein admitted that the lane closures had been deliberately ordered as punishment for Mayor Mark Sokolik's refusal to endorse Christie. He confirmed that there was no traffic study, and that the entire plan had been designed to create gridlock in Fort Lee. His statements also suggested that others in the governor's orbit had known about the scheme, though he stopped short of directly implicating Christie. His cooperation gave prosecutors the inside perspective they needed to build their case against Kelly and Baroni. The trial began in September 2016 in federal court in Newark, New Jersey. It drew national attention, not only because of the political drama surrounding it, but because it revealed how power was exercised behind the scenes in state government. Over several weeks, jurors heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, saw hundreds of emails, and listened to recordings that detailed the planning and aftermath of the lane closures. The prosecution's argument was straightforward: Kelly and Baroni had conspired with Wildstein to misuse public resources for political retribution. They had lied about a traffic study, deceived their colleagues at the Port Authority, and caused massive disruption to punish a local mayor. Kelly and Baroni, in their defense, insisted. By the time the Bridgegate case reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 2019, years had passed since the traffic jams that started it all. The political landscape had changed dramatically. Chris Christie was no longer governor, Donald Trump was in the White House, and most of the public had moved on from the story that once dominated national headlines. But for Bridget and Kelly and Bill Baroni, the fight was far from over. They had both served prison sentences before being released on bail pending appeal, and they were determined to clear their names. What was at stake now was more than just their personal freedom, it was a question of how far the law could go in treating political wrongdoing as a federal crime. Their lawyers argued that, while the lane closures were wrong, they did not amount to fraud under federal law. They hadn't sought money, kickbacks, or personal gain. The decision, they claimed, was a political act, an abuse of power, perhaps, but not a federal offense. Prosecutors countered that the defendants had used deception to seize control of public resources for an improper purpose, wasting government time and taxpayer money in the process. The case divided legal experts. Some feared that if the convictions were overturned, it would weaken the government's ability to hold corrupt officials accountable. Others warned that keeping the convictions would open the door to criminalizing ordinary political behavior. The Supreme Court heard arguments in January 2020. The justices, in their questions, seemed skeptical of the government's broad interpretation of fraud. They pressed prosecutors on the issue of intent, whether Kelly and Baroni had actually defrauded anyone, or whether they had merely misused their authority. Several justices pointed out that bad politics was not the same as criminal conduct. The tone of the hearing suggested that the court was leaning toward overturning the convictions. On May 7, 2020, the Supreme Court announced its unanimous decision. In a rare moment of agreement across ideological lines, all 9 justices voted to overturn the convictions of Bridget and Kelly and Bill Baroni. Writing for the court, Justice Elena Kagan said that while the defendants' actions were deceptive, abusive, and wrong, they did not constitute federal fraud because they did not seek to obtain money or property. The ruling effectively cleared Kelly and Baroni of criminal wrongdoing, though it did not erase the ethical and political damage caused by their scheme. The court's message was clear: not every act of political abuse is a federal crime. When the decision came down, Kelly expressed a mix of relief and bitterness. She said that her life had been shattered by the case, that she had been a loyal public servant who made a mistake but didn't deserve to be treated as a criminal. "It's a complete vindication," she told reporters, but it came 7 years too late. Baroni echoed her sentiments, saying that the decision restored